Hi, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk Risk, where our goal is to engage, inspire, and empower the global community of risk practitioners. I'm your host, Naveen Agarwal, and today I'm super excited to welcome my guest, Kristen Petersen. She is a principal medical writer and EUMDR specialist with many years of industry experience. She has prepared over 50 clinical evaluation reports covering a broad range of medical specialties. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with Kristen about how we should handle off-label use in clinical evaluation. This is going to be a very insightful conversation. But guys, as you sign in, please know that this is not a webinar or a lecture, and you have an opportunity to participate with your questions and comments. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and as much as possible, we'll bring in your comments here. So with that, Kristen, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm great. Hi, Naveen. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, wonderful, Kristen. So let's start by having you share a little bit of your personal story. How did you get into this space of clinical evaluation, which, from what I've heard, tends to be pretty challenging for people?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely have a unique experience coming to this field and kind of finding my niche in medical writing. So I work at Global Regulatory Writing and Consulting, and I was able to get in kind of when it was a small startup. So I was able to get in and figure things out. So this was back in 2017, which many of us, your ears perk up at that year. That was when we were transitioning from MDD to MDR. And so it was a really great time to be in that space because you had seasoned professionals who had been in the industry forever, as well as newbies like myself, just trying to figure out MDR and what to do with it and how to apply it and how to get, these certifications. So it was a really exciting time to be in the industry. That's kind of where I got my start. And so, I've been with Global. It's a clinical research organization. So we have a lot of different services, and I ended up in the medical device department doing certification in the EU. That's kind of how I got my start there, and I've been able to learn and grow with the industry.
That's awesome. And Kristen, we have so many people joining today from all over. I'm so excited to welcome everybody. Let's talk about off-label use, which is our main topic today. And just to set the stage right, can you help us understand what off-label use is, first of all, like why it is a big deal for us?
Yeah. And I think that's the big question in the industry right now, right? What is it? So I was consulting on some projects, and I was going through the literature, going through our post-market surveillance, and I was finding a lot of instances of what I interpreted to be off-label use. So I take it back to the manufacturer and to the stakeholders, and we were able to have a conversation about it. And then, like any good medical writer or person in this industry, I started digging into the regulations, started looking at some of the guidance documents. I started talking to different colleagues in different industries and different manufacturers to sort of understand what is off-label use. What does that mean? And it's very fascinating to go back to MDR. And when you search for that, it's very limited. So when we try to understand off-label use, we really have to take all from different documents to try to come up with a holistic understanding of what off-label use is, what it means, and how we include it in our clinical evaluation. At the basic level, off-label use would be when the device is used other than its intended use or its indications for use in the labeling.
Yes, and that makes sense. But, sometimes it becomes hard, especially for people who are not familiar with the regulatory requirements or space, to understand even what the intended use or indication is. So can you share a couple of examples of off-label use?
Yeah, definitely. So as a consultant and a contractor with Global, I've been able to work with a lot of different types of manufacturers in different therapeutic fields. And it's interesting to see sometimes your labeling, and this isn't, dependent on manufacturer. Sometimes your labeling is very black and white, and it's very, I don't want to say easy to interpret, but when you're going through the literature and you're looking for the off-label use, it can be pretty clear on label or off label. But recently, I've been able to work in the therapeutic field of peripheral interventions, and I think that this space in particular and the devices in this space can be very challenging because you have such broad and patient populations and all these pieces that go into labeling that should provide specificity can sometimes still be very ambiguous. But for example, in this peripheral intervention space, I think a lot of us may be familiar with, catheters and things like that. So let's look in the peripheral intervention space for a device that would be intended to occlude or embolize something in the peripheral vasculature. The mechanism here would be through blocking or reducing blood flow. And so what you could do is say, this is what the device is intended for. It's intended to occlude or embolize in the peripheral vasculature, for example, and then the labeling might provide a specific artery or a specific kind of tumor that could be treated. Well, let's say you're doing your literature search. You get a bunch of literature that comes back, and they're not used for those specified tumors or those specified arteries. Well, does that mean that those instances are off-label? Because if it occludes or it embolizes in the peripheral vasculature, is that on-label? It's off-label. And so that's an example, of when we're really drilling down to the specifics of an anatomy or a medical condition. How specific do we need to be? What kind of evidence do we need for those specific indications versus if we see in the literature that there's a wealth of use in other indications, kind of what do we do with the labeling? Do we make it more broad?
So this will be, what I'm understanding here is that this might be a discussion early on in the development phase where you are trying to decide what the labeling would be, right? You're trying to scope it out, how narrow or how broad your indication or intended use should be. Is that my correct understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. And
okay.
And then from LTR, right? We need evidence to support our indications, and so something more specific under MDR, and then it can be a challenge.
But then also in the post-market phase, we may learn by the literature review if people are using it off-label in practice, right? So there's a pre-market and there's a post-market. It's interesting because when I heard of off-label use for the first time, I immediately thought about post-market, but I'm hearing you say that, hey, it's a very important discussion in the pre-market phase also.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that we see in the industry, because everything is a cycle. It comes back around, right? So we have the pre-market verification and validation, and then we have the marketing. But then once it actually gets into the hands of the users, how is it being used?
To
go back?
Excellent point. Now, from the risk management point of view, my understanding is that off-label use is included in what 14971 says about reasonably foreseeable misuse, right? Is that a correct understanding? First of all, I want to confirm that with you.
So, yes, I know we love the phrase reasonably foreseeable, right? And that is a big thing, especially when it comes to the regulations, when it comes to your clinical evaluation reports. How I think part of the key is systematic, right? So when we're looking at this literature and we look at how it's being used, is this a one-off case report, or is this, a rogue user, or are we seeing actually a lot of users are using it in this manner or in indications? And then, on the other side, it's a great opportunity too to reevaluate the labeling and see this is actually saving many lives. This is very beneficial to the patients. A lot of physicians are using it off-label, but maybe we need to reevaluate the labeling and the marketing and include this indication.
Yes. And that's a great point, because in the beginning, we don't have that much foresight because we can have only some informed guesses. But in the post-market, we learn a lot more. To your point, if people are systematically, like the widespread off-label use, maybe, they look at the product and say, it could be used this way and that way also. And their intent may not be malicious, but they may actually try to solve some other problem at the point of use because they think the device could be used for that purpose. So I think point here is that we have to continually monitor literature, adverse events, to make sure that we are on top of our understanding and improving our foresight about this reasonably foreseeable misuse, right?
Yes, exactly.
And, just before we went live today, I did just a 30-minute quick search on FDA's MOD database, and I was able to find many examples of off-label use in orthopedics and cardiovascular, examples like pediatric devices being used on adults or the other way around. And I want to emphasize that it's not because the intent is malicious necessarily. It is because surgeons or doctors or healthcare professionals may feel like they can solve an issue at the point of use, right? So that's a reasonably foreseeable misuse. in my mind. We are not worried about a malicious intent. That will be like completely out of the scope of risk analysis from my perspective. That makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I can think of, a few specific examples of people that I've talked to or projects that I've worked on where it was exactly like you said, where, what was it? It was a sports medicine, like you mentioned orthopedics. Once they had kind of talked to the physicians who were using this device, they had kind of pulled out some information that they had been using it off label, but that they had had a lot of success and that it was needed for this specific patient population who hadn't been included before. And so they were able to change the labeling and then, of course, go through all the correct channels and do the testing to make sure that it was safe, and then change the indications for the device.
So I want to emphasize that point you just mentioned, because it's not always bad. Understanding off-label use may give us an opportunity to expand the scope of our intended use and indication, capture a bigger market. But we have to do the work. We have to do the work of analyzing the risks, controlling them, and then doing a submission so that we get the approval for this expanded scope, right? It could be an opportunity. It doesn't have to be a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. And you really hit the nail on the head, because that was one thing that I've seen moving from MDD to MDR. I was doing screening for literature, screening for a project under MDD. And if it was used off label, they said just exclude it. We don't want to look at it. It's being used off label. But then just the very next year or two later, the same exact device, same exact manufacturer under MDR, there had been a process change. Okay, we actually need to monitor this off-label use. And so when we started pulling in that literature for off-label use, we saw it was used more off-label than it was on-label. And so they started digging into that indication. And then, like you said, they were able to pull that in to the labeling. And so it was a great opportunity, obviously, for the manufacturer, but then eventually for the patients, that they were able to investigate use of this device for another indication.
And Kristen, I think this is where our regulatory colleagues can play a very strategic and critical role within their companies, working alongside with post-market people or quality people to understand what's happening in the off-label use space and maybe develop a strategy and propose an initiative to expand the scope. And I think they can be seen as taking a leadership role.
Yeah. So much of risk is a team effort, right? And so if we can get everyone in the right room, clinical and marketing, and it's tough. There's so many people that go, so many roles that go into these conversations, but it really does take a village in order to understand these devices and assess the risk and move forward. Because like I said, you have to have clinicians, right, saying to this indication, no to this indication or this mechanism or this condition. But then you also need marketing in the room. Are we marketing this to the right people? Are we that reasonably foreseeable and that intention behind it? If we're marketing it to people, but then it's kind of getting into another therapeutic field, let's dig more into this.
Yeah, and maybe there's an opportunity. All right, guys, if you are just joining, my guest today is Kristen Petersen, and we are talking about how to handle off-label use, especially in clinical evaluation. So, Kristen, we do have a question here from Priya, and she's asking, where exactly do we document the off-label use? If it is documented in the state of the art, shall we capture the safety and performance parameters from these occurrences through literature, for example? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. As we talked about, especially in regulatory and medical writing, it's all about documentation. So when we're looking for these, when we're doing that post-market surveillance and we're seeing these instances, it's very important to pull them into the report, but how do we do it, right? So I think the best place to start, and this is best case scenario, you build out your templates and you build out your SOPs to include monitoring off-label use. So specifically in the clinical evaluation report, build out a space within your clinical evidence of where you're finding this. And any clinical evidence that you report, you should be monitoring off-label use. So if you're pulling in sales and complaints, are you looking at your sales and complaints and seeing off-label use? Are you putting that in a separate category or a separate bucket? And then the same with your literature. You're saying with any post-market clinical follow-up studies, we need to make sure that we're building that in so that we're collecting that information if it's out there. So it's very important to make sure that we have that all presented in our clinical evidence. But yeah, I mean, for the state of the art, I think it would be more important to build out the off-label use if you're maybe looking at a labeling change. If you have the bandwidth and availability to dig into that a little bit and get some more information on state of the art and maybe a different indication, that would also be a great place to pull it in. And then, of course, when you do your analysis and your conclusions, you want to make sure that you're addressing that if it's an issue, if there are safety issues, and sort of the plan moving forward of how you're going to address that, again, with post-market surveillance.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's kind of summarize this so people can understand the flow. Obviously, we are learning about the potential off-label use through a variety of sources, complaints, adverse events, literature reviews, and maybe multiple people are involved. So we need to make sure that all of our procedures have a way to capture this information and they are linked with each other. And they are feeding this information. I do a lot of work around post-market surveillance. And to me, it should be fed into our post-market surveillance review meetings. Maybe a decision has to be made to do additional risk analysis on this or not. And that should feed into our risk management file. Maybe it goes into our CAPA process where we may have to implement more controls. So it goes into our quality documentation. And eventually we are summarizing all this work to build a clinical evaluation report or a PMCF report or whatever. I think there's a flow here in which the information flows from multiple sources and ends up in multiple documentations, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So we have another comment here that it's important to notice whether marketing toward off-label use in drug regulation, we need to understand why there's off-label use. So whether it's drugs or medical devices, what's the motivation for people to do this? And can you help us understand why this happens in practice? Why people, and these are trained professionals, they're not, just ordinary people, they're trained professionals. They're making a very deliberate, conscious decision to use a device or a drug for something that's not indicated. Can you help us understand why that happens?
Yeah, absolutely. And a great place to start is getting all those stakeholders in the room so we can have a very complete view of how the device is labeled and then also how it's being marketed. And so one great resource that I would suggest to everyone would be the Team Notified Body position paper on off-label use. And it shares a couple bullet points of ways that devices could be used off-label. And so, is it outside of the patient population? Is it outside of the medical condition or disease severity? And so on a project that I worked on recently, we got everyone in the room together. We looked at the issues with off-label use and we started with the labeling. Is the labeling ambiguous? Maybe physicians think that they are using it on label because that's how they understand the labeling. But from our perspective, they aren't.
Mm-hmm.
If there's ambiguity there, we need to fine-tune that labeling to make sure that it's crystal clear how the user should be using this device. So that's the very, first step that I think is best to sort of address. But then, like you said, sometimes they could be using it in a way where logically it makes sense to a physician to extend it to a different patient population or to extend it to a different disease state. So there's lots of different ways that it could be used off-label. Like you said, it could be very innocent. It's not malicious. Yeah. Just trying to find a solution and serve the patients, right?
Yeah, I think that is the point we should emphasize. And when the patient is in a critical condition during a procedure, the doctor will try anything and everything to make sure that that patient is safe, their life is saved, and they make a decision at the individual patient level considering all the factors. And one of that could be off-label use. But as manufacturers, we have to bring that information in and understand why this is happening and make sure we are addressing it. So Priya has a follow-up to the question that she asked. Does this necessarily mean that a PMCF study should consider the off-label use? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen it both ways. So I've seen PMCF like user feedback surveys where they specifically build in off-label use. Maybe they have specific indications to ask physicians, are you specifically using it off-label in this way? And then other times it's just like another category. So are you using the device and it has, a list of 20 different indications? Keep in mind, this example is in the peripheral intervention space. So there are, 20 different uses. And then they another category where the user can go in and specify, no, I wasn't using it under those 20 different indications. I was using it in this way. And then when we get that information back, we can evaluate if that is indeed off-label. So I've seen PMCF surveys that capture that. I've seen PMCF surveys that do not. But I think, again, it goes back to that anticipation of it might be used off-label and being
great.
Collecting that information. So if you can build that into your PMCF activities,
it's a great practice. Well, Kristen, we have several questions coming in. So Elif is asking, if patient uses the medical device longer than assigned shelf life on the label, is it also categorized as off-label use?
Yes. So if we're looking at the lifetime of the device, these things are verified and tested and validated. And that's really the conditions under which the medical device should be used. So if it's being used outside of what it's been validated and verified to do, then I would say that.
Well, we could consider that as a potential use error. Maybe they didn't check the expiration date and they used it, but it's still under the same bucket of reasonably foreseeable misuse. All right, let's move on. So we have several questions here. Lavanya is asking, does off-label use need to be declared in the clinical evaluation reports for EU?
Do you need to specifically monitor it? Or was this a one-off case? And I've found when it comes to the notified body responses and the notified body feedback, it's best to explain, to acknowledge that use, and then your plan moving forward, and just being clear with the notified body is the best way to mitigate any non.
So in this context, before I forget, let's make sure that we share that team notified body paper on off-label use. We will post that link in the show notes when we publish this podcast. So I think it'll be a great resource for people. Okay, Martin has a question here. Is off-label use not a use for an indication for which it is not approved, and yet the core intention of the intended use remains the same? Which means that, the core intention is the same, but it may not be specifically approved as an indication. So there might be a subtle difference here, but it is still within the scope of the intended use. Am I understanding this correctly, or is there a nuance here, Kristen, that we are missing?
Yeah, if I understand it similarly, and I think that kind of goes back to what I was talking about in that peripheral intervention space. There can be a lot of ambiguity there, and that's best when you go back to your team, you go through the labeling, talk about the specifics with your clinical team, and then moving forward, either remove that ambiguity, or it's best to evaluate, again, if it's system. I think that's really the key here. Is it happening over and over and over again? And what does that mean for safety for the patient?
And here's an interesting thought is coming to my mind right now, because I have seen many examples, especially because I monitor FDA warning letters a lot. Many examples where FDA is going after manufacturers for making marketing claims that are not approved or cleared through a 510(k) or a PMA or an IDE submission. And it seems to me that because of those claims, they might be off-label use, right? There might be a link because we are actually promoting.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
Is very, very strict about that when it comes to marketing.
Yeah. So part of the off-label use could be because of our own marketing. And part of the reason why off-label use is happening is because surgeons and healthcare professionals are trying to solve a problem at hand. Part of it could be that it makes sense to use it for this purpose, even though it's not specifically done. Part of it could be that there are so many indications that, hey, we are not sure, but maybe it could be used. So whatever the reasons are, what I'm hearing you say is that we need to be vigilant. We need to have procedures in place that allow this cross-functional collaboration and vigilance and monitoring and follow-up actions and documentation about off-label use. And it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it gives us an opportunity to actually increase our business and scope. So, great conversation here. As always, we are running short on time. It goes very fast. So guys, thank you for the conversation here. I'm going to give Kristen a couple of minutes to think about a few key takeaway points and share with us as closing comments. But in the meantime, I want to share with you, in the context of off-label use, post-market surveillance, clinical evaluation, there's a workshop that I offer, a 4-hour hands-on workshop on post-market safety surveillance. If you're interested in that, please reach out to me. The next session is coming up soon. I'll share all the information with you. So with that, Kristen, the floor is yours. Please share with us just 2 or 3 key takeaway points.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on and allowing me to be a part of this collaborative space to have this conversation, because that's really what we need when we talk about off-label use. We need to have collaboration throughout all of our teams and all of our departments. This isn't just a conversation for one person to have. We need to be on the same page when it comes to the regulations and moving forward with monitoring off-label use and coming up with a plan. So be thorough when you are grabbing your clinical evidence to pull into your clinical evaluation report. Look for off-label use and come up with a plan for addressing that. Come up with a plan for if it's systematic, and build these processes into your SOPs, build them into these conversations with your teams, anticipate it so that you can have that documentation and you can have that plan moving forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you so much, everybody, for showing up today and being so engaged and sharing your own perspectives, comments, questions. This is why these conversations are so amazing, that we all get together and use this opportunity to learn from each other. And Kristen, many thanks to you for taking the time, being so generous with your time and sharing your wonderful insights. I really appreciate it. I learned many things from you in this conversation today, and I hope our attendees also took away a few key points. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Naveen. It's been a pleasure.
All right, guys, have a good weekend ahead.